Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from. Welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Rose-Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP for short. Today, Paityn Macko and Matti Bradshaw from the International Crane Foundation will be speaking about a year in the life of the Aransas-Wood Buffalo whooping cranes. Before we get going, I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. And I'd like to mention that next week, Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan will be hosting the Prairie's Got the Goods Week. It's an annual week-long series of webinars taking place from March 10th to 14th. And these webinars will cover a variety of topics such as pollination, carbon, cows, and wetlands. We will also have a coffee table conversation about ranching stewardship this year. You can register for these webinars on the PCAP website. Just click on upcoming events and Prairie's Got the Goods Week. A reminder to our listeners out there, we have over 200 people registered, so you'll be muted for the duration of the presentation. But if you have any questions, just type it into the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard, and we'll answer questions towards the end of the webinar. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, North American Helium, Nutrien, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, and SaskTel. And in-kind support has been provided by the International Crane Foundation. I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters. First, Paityn Macko is the Outreach Biologist for the ICF Texas program. An Oklahoman, she obtained her bachelor's degree in biology at the University of Central Oklahoma. She later obtained her master's degree in marine conservation from the University of Miami, focusing on light pollution and its effects on sea turtle hatchlings. Her background includes the study of both freshwater and marine turtles, with an emphasis on outreach and education. She now works to increase awareness and empathy for whooping cranes along the Texas Gulf Coast and throughout the Central Flyway. Matti Bradshaw works for the ICF in the Texas office as the laden conservation whooping crane biologist. She started in January 2023 and has since been conducting research on whooping cranes on the Aransas-Wood Buffalo population. Role primarily focuses on research and monitoring of whooping cranes in Texas during the wintering period. Outside of work, she enjoys almost anything outdoors, especially fishing, watching baseball, listening to live music. And projects she has worked on includes roost sites on the Texas coast, behavior of inland wintering whooping cranes, use of freshwater wetlands, and monitoring of oversummering whooping cranes. Matti received her bachelor's degree in wildlife conservation and ecology from Texas A&M University and is currently finishing her master's degree in rangeland and wildlife management at the Texas A&M University in Kingsville. So with that, I will pass it over.
Amazing. Thank you, Caitlin. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Is that looking okay, Matti?
Yeah, looks good.
Perfect. Well, we're so excited to be with you guys today. Matti and I are both from the International Crane Foundation Texas program down in Rockport, Texas. And today we're going to be chatting with you about a year in the life of the Aransas-Wood Buffalo whooping crane. At the International Crane Foundation, our mission is to work worldwide to conserve cranes and the ecosystems, watersheds, and flyways on which they depend. We provide knowledge, leadership, and inspiration to engage people in resolving threats to cranes and their diverse landscapes. The reason we're all here today, of course, is the whooping crane, which is the tallest bird in North America. It's also the rarest of all crane species. There are 15 species of crane found worldwide. We have 2 in North America, the whooping crane and the sandhill crane. A great contrast here is the sandhill crane is the most abundant and the whooping crane is the rarest, and we have both. Standing at 5 feet tall, you can see they have some pretty interesting characteristics, like their snowy white plumage. They have that red crown, black face mask or a mustache, and that very vibrant yellow eye. Like many birds, they have hollow bones, so they only weigh about 11 to 17 pounds, and they have a wingspan of 7 to 8 feet. You'll typically see them in habitats such as this when they're down in the Texas coast. standing in water. This is a graph showing whooping crane populations since 1938. We're going to be talking specifically about the one in black today, which is our Aransas-Wood Buffalo population of whooping cranes. They dropped to an all-time low of 16 in the early 1940s, and today we're standing at about 336 in our population today. So as you can see, they've made quite a comeback from the early 1940s, and there's some reasons why they had such a quick decline. Historically, there may have been over 10,000 individuals across the globe. Their historic range, which you can see here in yellow, was pretty large with multiple wintering areas. The areas in this more purple color, that's their current range. So you can see this population migrates from down here where we are in Texas all the way up to the Northwest Territories in Canada, but their range has shrunk quite a bit. I will pinpoint some other populations on this map as well. We have the eastern migratory population, which spends their time between Wisconsin and Florida. In recent years, they've started short stopping in areas like Indiana and Alabama. We also have a non-migratory population in Florida, a non-migratory population in Louisiana, and there was a population in Grays Lake, Idaho, which was an experimental population that ended in the 1980s. So what caused the dramatic decline of whooping cranes? It was a bit of a perfect storm of habitat loss, unregulated hunting, and egg collection. They are a very tall white bird, easy to see on the landscape. And also their feathers and eggs were collected both privately and for museums and used in things like women's hats. Habitat loss is the one I really want to highlight because this is one they're still currently facing today. It was a major driver in their decline as time went on and wetlands were drained for agricultural development. This species, which is highly dependent on wetlands, lost a significant portion of their habitat, which led to that very quick decline. We do have some differing conservation concerns today. One of the major drivers for them currently for mortality is a collision with power lines, fences, and cars. Obviously, in the 1940s, we didn't have power lines, fences, and cars like we do today. So that's become an issue as our population migrates a pretty long ways, and it's the most dangerous time of the year for them. Diseases such as highly pathogenic avian influenza. We still do have some issues with poaching, but it has decreased significantly throughout the years. Again, issues with habitat loss, climate change, and adequacy of legal protections if there is a case of poaching or incidental take. For our birds down in Texas, they've rebounded pretty well from that 16 to our about 536 today, and part of that is due to the establishment of the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in 1937 by presidential proclamation. This was initially made for protection of waterfowl. They were aware that we had whooping cranes in the area, but this, similar to Wood Buffalo National Park in Canada, is pretty difficult to traverse and to access. So whooping cranes were not only protected by the scarcity of the landscape, but also because there were federal protections in place. If you look to this map on the bottom, that initial portion of the landscape was protected and eventually expanded into that barrier island section and the section on the far right. While they're down here in Texas, we typically see them in areas like salt marsh, bays, and freshwater wetlands. We think of coastal prairies and agricultural areas as secondary habitat, but in recent years, we have seen them spending more and more time in these areas. I also wanted to pinpoint that whooping cranes do not have a salt exclusion gland. So while they do spend quite a bit of their time in their primary habitat, like the salt marsh, when it does become too saline, they need to move inland to areas with more fresh water. So once bays and marshes reach about 15 to 30 parts per thousand, they need to move to find dietary freshwater. And that's when we see them more in the coastal prairie and ag areas. Also, just an interesting tidbit about whooping cranes is their relationship with prescribed fire. We did have Native people on the coast of Texas that would do prescribed burns, and we do prescribed burns to this day because whooping cranes like a very open landscape. It helps them be able to see predators coming. And they also will come in to forage after a burn. We think of it essentially as barbecue. So any of those invertebrates, plants, or anything that was burnt in the fire, they're able to forage on. And it also keeps woody plant encroachment down so that they're able to avoid predation. This map here was put together by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. It's a habitat suitability index of whooping crane habitat. So areas in red are high suitability for whooping cranes to spend their winters. In orange, we have medium habitat, and in yellow, we have low habitat. So this was essentially made so we could have a good idea of where we thought that whooping cranes would expand in the future, because habitat protection is very important for this species as they continue to grow. This area circled in blue is Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. As you can see, it's pretty good habitat for whooping cranes and where they spend a lot of their winter. And for any e-birders out there, reports are important for us as researchers of whooping cranes because we do track that data and it helps us understand where whooping cranes are moving, where we've seen them in the past, and where we see them today. So we do track these. So if you do see a whooping crane, you can either report it directly to bandedcranes.org or you can submit it on eBird and we will use those reportings. But this is eBird reports from December of 2008 to February of 2009. And as you can see, whooping cranes are really centered in and around Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, where we think of as their typical wintering habitat. But we start to see them really start to expand between December 2022 and February of 2023, and they started to expand where we think that they were going to expand due to that habitat suitability index moving up the coast and even further south into the Port Aransas area. But something interesting started happening in 2011. So we see whooping cranes are still spending a lot of their time on the coast, but we have these birds using some of these inland sites for their winter. So we see these blue dots slightly off the coast, and even further up near Austin, Texas, we have these pink dots. And these are birds spending their winter away from what we think of as typical wintering habitat. And this is a MoveBiz created by Matti to show what this movement between the coast and these inland sites look like. We have Granger Lake up near Austin and Colorado and Wharton County, which is outside of Houston. And since 2011, birds have been utilizing these inland sites, but not just these inland sites. You can see they're moving between the coast and those inland areas throughout the winter. And to put it into context, we think of this as a salt marsh dependent species, and that Colorado Wharton County area is about 63 kilometers from the nearest salt marsh, and Granger Lake is about 219 kilometers from the nearest salt marsh. So they're moving into these new areas. What's important to note about these areas that they're using inland is that they're cropland, so they're dominated by rice agriculture. And part of the reason why we see them remaining wet for most of the winter is that they're used for waterfowl, to bring in waterfowl. So even when rice farmers are not flooding their fields for rice, they're flooding their field for rice agriculture, and that is impacting whooping crane space use as well. Here's another MoveBiz showing what Aransas-Wood Buffalo migration looks like. These are juvenile whooping cranes. Whooping cranes make a biannual migration through the Central Flyway that is about 2,500 miles. It's a pretty narrow corridor, so you can see these juvenile whooping cranes are staying pretty close to the center line of the flyway, and they make about 11 to 12 stopovers per migration. So this is highly sped up, but you can see there's some significant stops throughout their time on migration. They are diurnal migrants, so they migrate during the day. So during their migratory period, you might be able to see, and I'm sure you guys who live in Saskatchewan see them migrating over. For their spring migration, it takes about 29 days on average, and for fall, it'll take a bit longer at 45 days. Their spring migration is typically shorter because they have that biological urge to nest and create new chicks. So they're moving faster up towards Wood Buffalo National Park. It's also really cool to note that their stopover duration increases with latitude. So the further north they get, their stopover times increase. Researchers have identified these 5 critical stopover sites along their migration route. I did mention that it is a pretty narrow corridor, and you can really see that here. The first important one for my Saskatchewan people is the Saskatchewan staging area. The next one is the Central Platte River in Nebraska. And then Kansas was lucky enough to get 2. They have Cheyenne Bottoms Wildlife Management Area. And just about 20 to 30 minutes south, you have Quivira National Wildlife Refuge. And in Oklahoma, you have Salt Plains National Wildlife Refuge. And these all have protections in place for whooping cranes during migration. And that is some background about whooping cranes, their migration, and some of their life history. I'm now going to pass it to Matti to talk about more in depth some of these beautiful spaces that whooping cranes use during their year.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for kicking us off. Paityn, if you want to go ahead and start that video, you can. Okay, so here I really just wanted to share with you guys. I know Paityn shared a similar movement visualization map, but with this one, I really wanted to highlight some of the area and movement across the continent that whooping cranes use, and especially some of the movements that they have going up to Wood Buffalo National Park, which is their breeding grounds, and then down south. So as Paityn mentioned, the cranes, as they move north, they spend quite a bit more time at those more northern latitudes, which is pretty interesting. And we think that that likely is because a lot of the sites that they visit on the fall, a lot of the sites that they visit in the southern part of the region on their migration are maybe struggling a little bit with habitat, whereas the ones on the south may be offering more adequate resources for them. And so as you can see, this bird, as it's moving south, it's using a little bit of a different route than it took on the way up. But as it moves further south, that corridor really narrows and becomes more apparent that those spaces are maybe less available for them. Next. Okay, so some of the habitats that they use on migration are going to include those freshwater wetlands, rivers, which they usually roost within, ponds, and they really like those open water sloughs with emergent vegetation. And then agricultural fields are going to be another important one, along with prairie. And so, as Paityn mentioned, whooping cranes are a pretty tall species, and so they like really open areas so that they can see for a distance. And they just feel a little bit more safe so that they're able to avoid predators. Next. And so here I just briefly wanted to talk to you all about some aerial surveys that the International Crane Foundation did of the Cimarron and Red Rivers, which are in Oklahoma. And so with this study, both of these rivers we know that whooping cranes use, but they're not yet considered a critical stopover site. And so we really just wanted to try to monitor them and quantify that use of these regions. And so we know that the whooping cranes are likely using them to roost. And so with these, we were flying the routes at sunrise so we could try to catch the cranes before they left these sites. But however, we did include adjacent fields as well and some of the surrounding water bodies. Next. And so here we have the Red River in Oklahoma, and as you can see, it lays true to its name. It gets its name from its high clay content in the soil, which gives it that red color. Next. And oops, sorry, will you go back one? So here we have some roosts that we came across on the Red River. And so while we were mostly interested in whooping cranes, we also included counts for sandhill cranes, pelicans, light geese, ducks, bald eagles, and swans as well. And so here we have some photographs of sandhill crane roosts that we had during the survey. I think the largest number that we had was 1,500 individuals, which was pretty incredible to see from the air. Next. And then here we have the Cimarron River. This one has a little bit of a lighter complexion than the Cimarron, or sorry, the Red River. And this is due to its high salt amount, which is from the surrounding landscape, which was really cool to see. It gets its source from one of the critical stopover sites for whooping cranes, which is Salt Plains National Wildlife Refuge. Next. And then here we have some photographs of birds using adjacent areas to the river. And so on top, we had a group of sandhill cranes using an adjacent field next to the river, and then a small water body, which I believe actually had some pelicans within it that we included in our counts. Next. And here I really just wanted to just take a minute and just share some of the landscapes that cranes are flying over, which really made it special to fly these regions from the air and really get an idea of what the landscape looks like from a crane's point of view. And it definitely did Oklahoma some justice. Next. And then this was a site that we included as an additional region to survey. So this is Salt Plains National Wildlife Refuge, which, as Paityn mentioned, is a critical stopover site for whooping cranes. And interestingly, it's a salt flat that's the remnants of an inland sea from thousands of years ago, which was just a really unique landscape. And we actually had our highest number of whooping cranes here. Next. We had a total of 32 whooping cranes, which was really exciting. That photo on the left is going to be a group of all whooping cranes. I think we had a colt within that group, and then we also had, I think, 3 other families. And whenever I say colt, I'm referring to the chick within a family group. That's just a fun fact that the chicks are called colts often. Next. And then here we have Quivira and Cheyenne Bottoms areas, which are critical stopovers for whooping cranes as well. They're often referred to in conjunction with each other due to their proximity. Like Paityn mentioned, they're around 20 miles from each other, so pretty important sites for whooping cranes. Cheyenne Bottoms is actually the larger of the two, and it falls in around 40,000 acres, and then Quivira is around 20,000 acres. So a little bit smaller, but still just as important for whooping cranes. Next. Oops. Oh, perfect. Okay, so one of the things that the International Crane Foundation has been a part of is there's actually a solar farm that's going up near Cheyenne Bottoms, and Paityn was actually one of our representatives that went to the area to try to help make recommendations for how to, install those solar farms in a way that would not be harmful to whooping cranes. Next. And so some of those recommendations included restricting solar development within 6 miles. And so this number of 6 miles actually came from some research related to sandhill cranes, which looked at their movements between their roosting, so their evening locations versus their foraging sites during the day. And they found that that was around 6 miles. And so we tried to restrict the solar development within 6 miles from Cheyenne Bottoms. And then we also recommended to protect that corridor between Quivira and Cheyenne Bottoms, since we know that they're both pretty important sites and likely that the whooping cranes may be moving between the two. And then also we wanted to ensure that the transmission lines that come with these green energy infrastructure are going to be either marked or buried. Whooping crane collision with power lines is one of their known causes of mortality, so we really wanted to ensure that those lines were marked or buried accordingly. Next. And then here I just wanted to highlight one of the effects of solar farms that we know to be true, which is the lake effect. And so with this, as you can see in that top right photo, solar panels are going to create quite a bit of reflection from the sun. And so that reflection actually mimics water, because that reflection also appears in water bodies. And so for water birds, they may spend some energy moving to those areas, or also there's a concern for collision, which may in turn make them more likely fall prey to predators that are within the area. And then also power lines, which I've already mentioned. All of these are concerns. And it's also, while they're on migration, the energy that they spend is, pretty critical to their survival. And so if they're wasting energy flying to these areas with what they think is water and it's not, they may be unable to conserve the proper amount of energy to make that migratory trip. Next. And then since we're already talking about it, I also just wanted to include a slide on wind turbines, which is another common energy infrastructure that's going in to a lot of the areas that whooping cranes use. And so we know that whooping cranes avoid wind turbines, which in turn causes a loss of habitat for them, since they're going to just completely avoid that area. However, there have been instances of mortality with sandhill cranes and colliding with them. So it's still a bit of a concern because of that. And then also still going to require those transmission lines from those power sources. Next. So here we have the Platte River in Nebraska, which is a pretty incredible site, as you can see. This is also another critical stopover site for whooping cranes that they use. Next. And it's also a pretty important stopover for sandhill cranes. This area sees a lot of ecotourism from people moving into this area just to come experience these large numbers of cranes, and also whooping cranes. This was actually the first area I ever saw a whooping crane within, and it was a pretty incredible experience seeing that one whooping crane. People often refer to it as Bob because it's a common occurrence for whooping cranes to show up as an individual with thousands of sandhill cranes, which is just incredible. Next. And then here we have the prairie pothole region of South Dakota. So the prairie pothole region actually extends into Canada. However, the region in South Dakota seems to be especially important for whooping cranes, since a lot of them do spend much of their time there on migration. And so the prairie pothole region is characterized by depressional wetlands that were formed from glaciers a few thousand years ago. And it's also well known for its high numbers of breeding waterfowl within the region. And like many other sites in whooping cranes regions, it's also experienced high rates of wetland conversion to cropland. So many of the wetlands in this area are drained for development of cropland. Next. And then here we have the Saskatchewan prairies in Canada. So this is the spot where they finally make it across the border and begin using these areas. The prairies in Saskatchewan are pretty important for them since it's one of the only places where that's known for whooping cranes to spend a lot of their summer outside of Wood Buffalo National Park. If you want to go to the next slide. And so here, we know that the whooping cranes, the younger birds, are spending a lot of their summers in this region. So they just don't have that biological drive to make it all the way to Wood Buffalo National Park. Whooping cranes typically don't breed until they're 4 or 5 years old. And so they go through what's called a dating period where they're figuring out some social dynamics. And whooping cranes are also kicked out of their family groups around 9 months. So on their migration north, typically. And with that, there's a lot of young whooping cranes that are trying to figure it out. And so the Saskatchewan prairies is pretty important for them to figure out how to be social and be a whooping crane on their own without their parents. Next. And then here we have the Marshland Wetland Complex, which is an area that's around Saskatoon. Some of you may or may not be familiar with, but it is pretty important. It's the last stopover site before they make it to Wood Buffalo. And it's especially important on fall migration since there's a lot of waste grain in the areas surrounding the wetland complexes. And that gives them or provides carbs for the cranes as they make their way south, especially since they've probably just come out of breeding and maybe needing to refuel since that is extremely tolling on their bodies. Marshland Wetlands has also had some of the highest numbers of whooping cranes in the same area. I think the largest count is around 150 individuals, which is really incredible. However, there are some concerns with whooping cranes grouping up in groups that large, since it may make them fall to if there's ever a disease outbreak or if there's ever a natural disaster that occurs within the same area. However, it is still a pretty important site for them. Next. And then here we move into Wood Buffalo National Park. I got to go up to Wood Buffalo this past summer, and it was a pretty incredible experience. So I'm really excited to get to share this with you guys. I was actually there for the Northern Whooping Crane Festival. I've only ever gotten to attend the one here in Texas, so I was really excited to experience the northern parts of Canada and get to know some of the new areas for me that whooping cranes use. Next. Okay, so the field work that I was assisting with was for Laura Neary's PhD work. And so Laura is a hydrologist. And so she was looking at water quality and chemistry of nest sites that whooping cranes use. And so those photos on the top row are going to be nest sites that consist of bulrush, which is their most common nest material. However, they also do use cattail, which is pictured on that bottom row. Next. And here we have a photo of 2 nest sites that were within the same wetland. And so whooping cranes typically return to the same wetland every year, but may not necessarily use the same nest site. And so here these 2 nest sites are within the same wetland, and the one on the right was likely the one that was used this year. And so it was pretty interesting to see sometimes there were 3 or 4 nest sites that were within a wetland that you could see a pair had, really tried and hopefully been successful at each year. So it was just really cool to see the progression of sites throughout the years. Next. And then here we had a bit of a surprise that we found on the during the field work, which was an abandoned whooping crane egg. And so whooping cranes typically lay 2 eggs in a breeding period. However, usually only 1 chick survives. There have been several instances of twins in the past, but I think it takes a really good breeding year to support both of the chicks. And so with this egg, you can see that there's a water line that occurs on the outside of the eggshell. And so we think that either if the nest wasn't compact enough, maybe the egg had, wiggled its way down through the structure of the nest, or maybe the parents just accidentally kicked it out of the nest and left it abandoned in the water, which I learned was something that happens more than you think. And then in this middle photo, I really wanted to point out, we put the nest or the egg back into the nest just so we could take this photo. And so as you can see, there's some eggshell fragments that are present at the nest, which which indicates that at least that chick did hatch. However, we don't know that it survived, but hopefully it did. And so that was, kind of nice to see that maybe there was still a chance that they were successful with at least one of the chicks. Next. And then here we have a photo of a family of whooping cranes. And so I was there in September, and so I wasn't totally sure if I was going to get to see whooping cranes in Wood Buffalo National Park, let alone a family. I think this was a lower breeding year for them. So this was actually the only family that I got to see that was still in the park. Much of them had already left to Saskatchewan. And so I know this is not the best photo, but at the time it was very exciting to see that family. And that chick is in the middle. He's just a little bit more brown than the two parents. Next. Oh, and if you want to go ahead and play it. So this is a video that I took from the helicopter, and it's kind of grainy still, but you can see those two whooping cranes hanging out in that wetland. And I really just wanted to share this just to highlight how large those wetlands are indeed, which was pretty cool. Next. And then really quickly, I wanted to mention Salt Plains, which is within Wood Buffalo National Park. And so this is an area that is outside of the core area that the whooping cranes have historically bred within. And so like we see in Texas, whooping cranes are also expanding the regions that they're using just like in breeding and in wintering. So this was an area that had a nest site that was a newer area that they'd used, which was pretty incredible. The nest is somewhere within this large wetland, but yeah, really, really cool to know that they were indeed using it. Next, yeah. And so here I just wanted to include these two photos. So like I mentioned, Salt Plains National Wildlife Refuge in Oklahoma is a critical stopover site for them. But I really just wanted to throw these two photos in here just for a side-by-side comparison of Salt Plains that's in Wood Buffalo National Park. And so as you can see, it's pretty incredible, the similarities between the two. Next. And then really quickly, I just wanted to share some other photos of Salt Plains that really just give you a good picture of the landscape and the makeup of this area. But the photo on the left, I especially wanted to highlight because we have a plant that's very similar in Texas. It's called glasswort. And these two species are actually related and have an extremely high salt tolerance. So it's just really cool to see the alignment in vegetation of these two regions that are across the continent that whooping cranes are using. And yeah, thank you guys. This has been really fun to share some information of our work and the areas that whooping cranes use. So thank you so much for your time. And if anyone has any questions, I believe we have some time to take them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting, really informative. This is our first ever whooping crane presentation. So yeah, thank you both for sharing your expertise. And of course, we have lots of questions. So I'll just give them to you. And if you don't know the answer, if you want to bounce them off of each other, whatever works. So the first one is, why do you think whooping cranes are salt marsh dependent species when most of their historic range is not salt marsh habitats?
That's a
I think
really
this is just misspeaking on my part. I meant to say wetland dependent species. They do utilize a lot of salt marsh while they're here on the Texas coast, but they're a wetland dependent species, and we see that across their range of migration.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for clarifying. Do you know if there are any salt marshes or saline wetlands that are like in Wood Buffalo or on their migration routes?
Yes. So on migration, I know that Salt Plains is definitely one of them, but I think there actually are a few other sites. Like I believe the Platte River in Nebraska also has a bit of saline characteristics in it as well. And then interestingly, which this is Laura's work, but I think she was beginning to find that some of those wetlands were actually a bit more salty, which was really surprising. And then Salt Plains in Wood Buffalo National Park is also the remnants of an inland sea. And so that, may be a source to some of those more local areas that are a bit more salty.
And the same with Kansas. It's actually an inland salt marsh, which was a remnant of a sea as well.
Yeah,
Okay.
so a lot of the areas that they use do have salt characteristics.
Yeah, yeah, we definitely have some salty areas in Saskatchewan here, that's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, we have a question about Last Mountain Lake in Saskatchewan. It's just north of Regina, and Tracy is wondering if you know when we would expect to see them coming through there.
So they typically leave Texas in around April 15th. So it could be any time between April into, I believe, May or June. Is that right, Paityn?
Yes, so the more, if they're of breeding age, the more mature individuals who know what they're doing, they're going to start laying their nest in May and work on them pretty quickly. But then some juveniles might be a little bit more late in the game and hang out, as Matti was talking about, in Saskatchewan even for their entire summer. So they could be a little bit slower in their migration.
Okay. And so is it possible to see the cranes in Marshall and Saskatchewan in both spring and fall, or do they tend to just stop there once a year?
Yeah, so you can see them in both spring and fall migration. I believe they spend a bit more time there during the fall, though.
Okay, do you have any approximate dates by chance for when people could make their way there to look for them? Maybe they'll find one.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I'd have to, my boss was actually just in Saskatchewan, so I'd have to ask him because during the time that he was there, which I can't remember which month it was, but they definitely saw larger groups of whooping cranes.
And
So I'm not
maybe
totally sure on the exact date, but
that's okay, no problem. Maybe eBird is a good resource for people that are looking. Although we did have someone write in to say October is a good time. I know that's when the snow geese start to pass through Saskatchewan too, but eBird seems to be a good resource and people can look there and see when is a good time to go if they're going to make the trek that way. Yeah, so we have a few more questions. I don't know if you know this one or not, but a listener named Sherry is wondering, did the Canadian fires affect the cranes at all? We had a lot of wildfires the last couple of years.
right, yeah, and the Northern Whooping Crane Festival was actually postponed a year due to the fires. I think the entire town of Fort Smith was evacuated because of them. I think, the researchers are looking into the effects of wildfire, but we, don't totally know. It may have had an impact, that year was also a lower breeding year, but we don't know if that's because the whooping cranes were spending their time in different areas or if there were other factors affecting it. But they usually in other regions, they do like prescribed fire and they do take advantage of the resources that become available because of them. But we just don't know the effects yet of a wildfire, especially to that degree.
Absolutely. Do you have you done any research about wildfire smoke and the impact on them as they're migrating?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question and one that I don't think that we've totally looked into yet. But yeah, I would assume that they would just avoid the smoke, and I don't think that it would affect their health or anything like that. I think that they would just try to fly around it, would be my guess.
There's cases, I can't remember if this is published data yet, Maddie, that they're able to recognize smoke, at least when it comes to foraging. So there is recognition for what it is.
Okay. Yeah, in the last few years, we've had tons of wildfire smoke here in Saskatchewan, and I think 600 miles or 1,000 kilometers from any forest fire or any like wildfire that's happened, and the smoke is unreal here. So I've always been wondering how it impacts birds. Yeah. And somebody's wondering about what they feed on in the salt marshes.
We say pretty much anything. They're opportunistic omnivores, so pretty much
Okay.
anything that they can fit in their beak and they can find in the salt marsh, they're going to take a crack at it. This could mean snakes, it could mean crustaceans, invertebrates, whatever they can find. Things will become available at different points in their year. So when they get down here, we have what's called the Carolina wolfberry plant. So they're not always fruiting once they get down here, but maybe a month or so after they've arrived, then they'll start really utilizing Carolina wolfberry and blue crabs. But along their migration route, their diet varies quite a bit throughout the salt marshes.
Oh, right on. And we have a couple questions about the lake effect from solar panels. A listener named Kara is wondering, how do you reduce the lake effect? Is it only with distance buffers, or is there another method?
So with the lake effect, there are multiple types of solar panel configurations. So we see the lake effect typically with photovoltaic. The distance buffer is really based off that sandhill crane roosting and foraging data, how far that they'll move for food. So really that's reducing any power line collisions. So we want to make sure that solar facility is far enough removed. Typically, they're built pretty close to water, good wetland habitat because they need that water for the solar for solar farms. So we want to make sure that solar farm is far enough away that we're reducing risk of power line collisions and the lake effect as well. But it really depends on what type of solar facility is going in.
Okay, that makes sense. And with wind turbines, now that there's an increase of wind turbines across the prairies, how will cranes be protected, if at all?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one as well. And that's why some of the recommendations that Paityn helped make that were affecting Cheyenne bottoms, we try to continue to make for new groups. But yeah, it's definitely difficult since a lot of the time we don't know where the areas are being constructed. So it is a bit of a concern. But yeah, mostly for whooping cranes, we try really hard to focus on the power lines that come from those energy sources because we know that they are a cause of whooping crane mortality. So making sure that they're either marked or buried is pretty important.
Okay. And on your slide with the power lines, it looks like you have a few different techniques for marking them. Has there been research to figure out which technique works the best?
Yeah, so one of our colleagues that actually works with the Eastern migratory population has done some research on those, and so she has recommendations for the specific types of markers. Obviously, burying them would be the best option since it just totally takes them out of the equation for collision. But she does have specific markers that she found are more effective for the cranes to recognize. And those are, I don't know what they're called exactly, but they essentially form like a little bit of a V and kind of swivel. So as the wind is, blowing slightly, they move and the cranes are able to recognize them.
Hey, and is this something that like a nonprofit does, or do you get collaboration from the power companies to be able to do this? And I'm asking because in Saskatchewan, we've got like thousands and thousands of kilometers of power lines here.
Yeah, and so yeah, I would say both. So our organization works to bury them, but we also do collaborate with power line companies that are also trying to minimize those effects as well.
Right. Awesome answer. It's pretty neat that you guys are doing that. Burying them must be a lot of work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, burying them is a little bit more expensive than actually marking them. So that's another issue with it.
Yeah, but probably more effective for a ton of other wildlife too.
Definitely.
Mm. And Bobby's wondering, why do you think they're moving inland to areas like Ranger Lake, and why do they stay there all year?
That is a great question. So that's actually something that we're trying to understand a bit more. We know in 2011 that was whenever the severe drought occurred, and we actually saw a lot of different movements from whooping cranes across the U.S. Like so, not just in our population, but also in the eastern migratory population. And so they may have moved inland due to higher water availability. And since then, they've just kind of learned how to use that area and, the amount of resources that are available to them. Interestingly, that area that we're looking into, which is in Colorado and Wharton County, which the cranes still regularly use, is predominated by rice agriculture, which oftentimes in Texas is rotated with waterfowl hunting. And so a lot of times that those fields are kept wet due to that. And so, which is a pretty interesting relationship. But yeah, so they sometimes rice is also kept on the landscape for them. And so the whooping cranes, it seems that they've learned to take advantage of that for sure.
Yeah. And so are these whooping cranes that were born in Alberta and then went down to Texas and they're like, no, I don't want to go all that way back, and they just hang out there then? Or are these ones that have like summered there and been born there?
So all of the cranes in the Aransas-Wood Buffalo population are typically born in and around Wood Buffalo National Park and then migrate down to Texas. And then, yeah, sorry, was that your question?
Yeah, so that means they're not coming back. I'm almost insulted. Come back to Canada. We love whooping
Yeah,
cranes here.
they'll be back soon.
Yeah, we'll pass them back to you guys here in a month.
And Hayden is wondering, with water levels rising along the Gulf Coast, how will this affect whooping cranes in the coming future?
That is a great question. I don't know if you want to take this one, Paityn. Yeah, it's with rising sea levels, we're going to lose habitat, but we're also going to have habitat be transformed. So what once was coastal prairie will be transformed to salt marsh. So you're going to lose some of that land, but it's going to be shifted. A lot of the issue is going to be water depth. Whooping cranes are not swimmers, they're waders. We do have some species of cranes that have started to swim a little bit, or are more adept at swimming than our whooping cranes. So you're just going to see them moving further inland as we see this regime shift in habitat.
Okay. Okay, thanks for that answer. I liked how you put that they're waders and not swimmers. It seems like they have quite a few, and this is, I've never seen one before. I've never had the chance to. Lots of sandhill cranes, but never a whooping crane. It seems that they have lots of quirks about them. And this is a question for each of you. What's the funniest thing that you've seen them do, or the funniest fact about them, or most unusual?
Oh, there's so
I feel like
many.
I know what you're going to say, Matti.
Yeah. Honestly, there's so many things I could say, but the first one that came to mind, which has been a really recent one, so one of the days that I was observing cranes and collecting some crane behavior data this winter, the wind high was around 40 miles per hour. And so the cranes were actually trying to dance. And so it was actually really hilarious because they would, during their dance, they typically jump up in the air and, flap their wings and try to appear very agile for their mate. But during this time, the wind was just taking them. And so they were not able to make that. I mean, I guess it was still a dance, but it was just more of a high altitude dance. So it was pretty funny.
It would be. They're persistent.
Yeah.
That's a great question for Matti because one of her studies is looking at their behavior of the inland versus the salt marsh birds to see if any differences exist. So Matti knows their behaviors very well. I would say for me, every once in a while when the bay tide is pretty low, we'll find them out in the bay fishing. And if we're lucky, we'll get to see family groups teaching their chicks how to forage for certain objects. And very similar to people, at the beginning, when they arrive here, the chicks are being supplemented by mom and dad and being taught different foraging tactics. But by the end, mom and dad are a bit sick of it and they're kind of like, you're on your own. We taught you some things, but you'll hear this little peep above the wind of them begging mom and dad for just a little, whether it be what are those worms called? Eelworms or clams or whatever it is. And you'll just see mom and dad start to get that frustrated, like, you have to do this yourself now, towards the end of the season. So it's interesting to watch the shift in behaviors as they're about to start migrating back.
Yeah, we had a chick a few weeks ago, which during this time, they're typically like figuring it out on their own. But yeah, we had one who was just robbing his parents, like was not foraging on his own and was just whatever food his parents were getting, he was stealing, which was pretty interesting. So he needs to get it together soon.
Yeah, for sure. And so a few more questions have come in. Why do they all now migrate to Wood Buffalo National Park to breed? Historically, have they always done this, or have they used other areas for breeding?
I don't know if you want to take this one or.
Um, the map in the beginning, I showed, you could see they had a pretty wide extent for their breeding range. And I think the fun fact with Wood Buffalo National Park is we didn't know where they were breeding when they dropped down low. And it was actually wildfires that led researchers to know where they were. So they were fighting wildfires in Canada, looked down, firefighters saw whooping cranes and whooping crane nests, because we had at that point no idea where they were going to breed because there were so few. So their historic range had pretty expansive breeding habitats, but now it's really just Wood Buffalo National Park in the surrounding areas.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah,
And
like I may have mentioned, the area in Wood Buffalo National Park is really difficult to access. Like you have to access it from helicopter, and so that may have also played a role in protecting them from humans, since we couldn't really get there without a plane.
yeah, that makes sense. And what happened in Idaho? You said that there was a historic population, but there's not anything there right now. Is that correct?
So the Idaho population was about the time ICF was getting started. So this was before our time of research, really. But researchers start with preface this, whooping cranes imprint when they hatch. And so as a way to reintroduce whooping cranes to Idaho, they gave sandhill cranes eggs to become foster parents for whooping cranes. But of course, whooping cranes imprinted on sandhill cranes once they hatched, lived with sandhill cranes until they were of breeding age. And then when it came time to breed, wanted to breed with sandhill cranes. And that's how whoopsies occurred. So it was a sandhill crane, whooping crane hybrid, and they stopped that experimental population in the 80s. So it went from about the 70s to the 80s. And they did have whooping cranes there for a while, but not anymore.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. I like the name Whoopsies. And how do predators, like coyotes and foxes, play into their mortality rates?
I'm actually not sure what the percentage of mortality is exactly. I know that the chicks are more at risk for it since they're still learning how to defend themselves, whereas the parents may be quite a bit successful. And so there's, yeah, obviously some concern with that. We've seen the whooping cranes that live in Port Aransas, which is pretty close to the refuge. Some of the techniques that they use to fight off coyotes and distract them and pull them away from the chick are pretty interesting. But yeah, I think it's mostly a concern for them roosting at night. And so some of their roosting habitat, they roost in water bodies. And so they like to select areas that have a little bit less of an effect from predators. And, they like to be in the water so that they can hear the predators approaching as well. But yeah, they definitely kind of need to be snuck up on.
And I think one of you mentioned banding, like bands. What do the bird bands tell you, or the leg bands?
So I think about 10% of the population is banded. And so it depends on, some of the birds may just have color bands. And so that gives us a unique identifier so that we know who that individual is. And we can also look up banding information to get information on age or where they were banded. So you can, kind of get the background on that bird. But there also are some birds that have some GPS transmitters, which researchers use to identify unique movements that whooping cranes may make, or also their habitat selection. So the habitat suitability map would be one that probably benefited from tracking data, because you just can get a better idea of what the whooping cranes are doing when we can't see them. A lot of, the coast is inaccessible from people, so the GPS transmitter data is heavily beneficial to get a picture into areas that we just can't access. So
That makes sense.
yeah.
We're kind of running out of time here, but Jillian has written in to say that there's actually a whooping number hotline that people can call to report whooping crane numbers or sites throughout the spring or fall migration. So I just sent that in the chat. Oh, I think I just sent it to the hosts and panelists. I will send it to everybody. So if anyone's interested in reporting whooping cranes, the number's right there. Otherwise, you can probably Google it and find it there too. But that's all the time that we have. Paityn and Matti, thank you so much for the really interesting presentation and for sharing your passion of whooping cranes with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been really great
Yeah.
to engage with you guys and share information. So thank you all so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. And to all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for tuning in to today's webinar. We've recorded it, so the recording will be available in the near future if you know someone that would have loved it as much as you did. And when you leave today's webinar, there'll be a quick 1-minute survey if you don't mind filling that out. That helps us keep our Native Prairie Speaker Series going into the future. So with that, thanks so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye now.